I'm Jen, and you're listening to Knick Knack Goes to the Movies, the one-stop shop podcast for all things movies, TV, and pop culture.
Turns out he's a major cinephile. They don't watch enough movies! It's a very simple formula! And here we go. Well, folks, it is finally back to what I set out to do when I made this podcast. Something that came from the quarantine pandemic time. The last time I was in theaters was February 11th of 2020. I saw Birds of Prey and the fantabulous emancipation of one Harley Quinn. That is a mouthful, I know. Little did I know how long I would be out of theaters at that moment, but this podcast is called Knick Knack Goes to the Movies. And while I love to talk on TV shows, streaming things, and apparently slasher franchises from the 80s, I am finally going back to the movies. While I missed out on both The New Mutants and Tenet in theaters, still haven't seen Tenet. I am vaccinated, 2 weeks past it, so it's time. Now, what movie was I celebrating on this momentous occasion? Well, no, I don't think The Conjuring and the spooky haunted nun thing is for me in theaters, but that'll be a little taste of something fun to come next week. Instead, I went for the Emily Blunt and John Krasinski horror sequel, A Quiet Place Part 2. Their chemistry was awesome in the first one, as it should, with the couple being married in real life, something I will still hope for to bring to the Fantastic Four, the live action representation, to break that out of its endless rut. So in the spirit of this now franchise, I wanted to also talk on some movies that seem to take inspiration from their thriller movies about creatures that you can't look at or you best not make any sounds around. In this episode, we will talk on A Quiet Place 1 and 2, Bird Box, and The Silence. So to quote Vinny from the criminally underrated Disney film Atlantis, don't move, don't breathe, don't do anything, except maybe listen to the greatest pop culture podcast to be conceived during a pandemic. Also, as this is a newer movie involved in this episode, for serious this time, spoiler alerts aplenty. The film that kicked this subgenre niche of thriller films, A Quiet Place, came out in the spring of 2018. And this is the easiest cast list to ever do on a movie or show I'm talking about. Although The Silence has a pretty small cast as well, most people have some idea of the acting credits of Emily Blunt and John Krasinski. Emily Blunt was a bit more film-based with one of her early breakout roles in The Devil Wears Prada. I still have to see the Sicario series someday. While I'm not necessarily a huge sitcom and Office person, as you know, loyal listener, I get it was a big deal. That, of course, helped him get to the Amazon TV series version of Jack Ryan, and he became a name-brand actor as a whole. But I have to say, some of his early career, it's an interesting filmography reel. I had no idea he was in Dreamgirls or Shrek the Third. I am still pretty confident that franchise dropped off hard after the second Shrek. Also, this is another have-to-own-it or pay-to-rent-it movie. Amazon Prime away, folks. To start, A Quiet Place kicks off in a way that immediately sets the scene of loneliness, eeriness, and just feels the way you would expect any zombie movie to be. Heck, we're all used to those loneliness things already, am I right? Nope, just me? Okay, moving on. That, of course, is not to discredit this movie at all. I feel like the zombie genre gets a bad rep after the oversaturation of the market with The Walking Dead and Dawn of the Dead. Look, Army of the Dead just came out. It's still going strong. Everyone wants to jump on it. But this movie finds a way to make a post-apocalyptic creature flick unique and actually terrifying. This movie also really got me curious about learning sign language, something I didn't end up picking up during this pandemic, maybe the next one. Sorry, that might be too soon. Jeez. This movie, even years after watching it the first time, makes things that seem so mundane absolutely terrifying. I love that scene where there is this innate fear about something from this family of five. You get the gist that sound is bad, but the big threatening object in question, the first whodunit reveal, is just some rocket ship with batteries, and the youngest kid, not fully grasping the severity of sounds equals not so good. I have talked about the Chekhov's gun principle ad nauseum on this podcast. Normally, If you see a gun in a movie, it will most likely be used down the road. This is exactly what A Quiet Place does with the toy rocket and sound-making devices, and making it a kid who, air quote, sets it off, challenges what you would expect, and it is a great way to show us just what happens when sound gets made. The family dynamic of 3 kids and their unique quirks with these parents is such a short time is a great show not tell storytelling style. But when we finally hear that rocket ship sound after so much quiet, the sheer terror and tension of no one being able to make a sound, and John Krasinski running hard to no avail to save his youngest, and seeing what these creatures look like. So much good in such a small time, just 10 minutes into this movie. Honestly, the concept of the plot is fascinating. Not being able to really communicate by speaking and just having to live such a different life than you have grown up with. Raising kids in this world must be wild, which obviously is a big part of this movie. At its core, it's a family movie. Not a family-friendly movie, but a family movie nonetheless. I feel like the zombie movie comparisons are there more than a generic apocalypse movie. The creatures are out there, and weirdly it's more livable as long as you never screw up or ever make sounds of any kind. That sounds harder, but if this was zombies, that amazing Abbott family farm setup would not last long. But even seeing this awesome setup of food aplenty, space, lights, a radio, an observation, technical station, this family of 4 kinda has it all. And it's interesting to see that everyday tasks are being done so differently. Prepping a spot for a baby that is padded and protected but has an oxygen supply. The kids taping up newspapers to full seal out their bunker space. This, of course, is the big issue of having kids in an apocalypse. This story was played out time and time again in The Walking Dead, and normally is a bit trickier to maneuver. And this world with sounds, it seems worse. Why have another baby during this time? Life finds a way, and true love and all that. But there are some clear setbacks to this whole setup. Speaking of sounds and people, we see hints of others existing. Something I super forgot. Lighting the beacons of Gondor in style. But we never actually see all these people. In fact, we really only ever see one person, and it's the same only other person in the trailer. This is going to be explored further in the sequel with Cillian Murphy and Djimon Hounsou. Like most zombie and apocalyptic things, they have to play with the idea of a new normal, a small, idyllic new community or family. But like any good movie or show in this genre, they find a way to show things are nice and serene, really set you in a comfort mood, only to bring you back to one small misstep and the horror show begins anew. And while jump scares can come and go, it can be deserved or cheap, this movie's relationship with sound, something innately woven into its fiber and DNA. Any remote sound, be it made by this family or one of these nightmare creatures or literally anything. You are terrified for listening so intently to this overbearing quiet. Also, there is some real emotional catharsis, and honestly, it feels mad clever to have music on headphones, to have a cute couple dance for Blunt and Krasinski. Having never raised a kid myself, but having been a camp counselor for what seemed like ages back in the day, I am sure parents would both hate and love this movie for the story it tells of trying to raise kids and expecting them to do things that need to be done, but now in this terrifying world. I mean, this world is so different and scary for all these people who have to grow up in it, raise kids in it, and just exist. While the waterfall scene is awesome, teaching us all about more rules of this world and how waterfalls and river sounds can more distort these creatures' senses. It goes without saying that while their family digs and setup is super cool, living by a waterfall or something like that would clearly have helped out in the long run. That trailer scene, while awesome, where there's this old man screaming out in agony to get one of these creatures to take him, this movie just finds ways to horrify and keep you on the edge of your couch, bed, chair, maybe seat if you have a cool home theater setup. That was a brief scare, but the whole sequence of that Chekhov's gun principle of a nail in the stair, you're just waiting for someone to step on. Gosh, rewatching this movie, there are so many good moments that still work, scare, and hold up. It is crazy to think this movie comes in at just an hour 30, when it feels like the stress takes at least 5 years off your life, and there is so much time left and spent in that final scare scene, trying to get everyone back together safely. Even with all the planning and logistics to thinking about ways to solve any situation that could come up, things just go so wrong so quickly, and while you're pretty sure everyone's going to make it out, if you haven't seen this movie yet, spoiler alerts here as well, it just doesn't feel like it's possible. But man, does that end get you good. Who would have thought Krasinski would be the one to die here? He did it to sacrifice himself and to save his kids, and the end is a true heartbreaking but powerful story of love. I forgot how good this intimate movie was, and I was incredibly excited to see how Krasinski was used in the sequel, being mostly in the future with a little bit of hybrid prequel in there. Look, he was famously dead. We didn't see his body, but come on, everyone is acutely aware that he did not make it out of this movie. Also, lastly, I know I didn't really touch on it before, but overall, having the hearing aid play a part in the solution for these creatures, it's a really nice payoff. And overall, the creatures also just look really good and terrifying, something that feels right out of Stranger Things. The end is a little bit of a cliffhanger that only marginally gets touched on. It feels like it glosses over the conflict. Not Resident Evil Final Chapter bad, but not so far off that either. But it was so much fun back-to-back watching the Quiet Place 1 and 2 movies. One from the comfort of my couch, one from the comfort of the movie chair. At the movies, the cup holders, the armrests, the movies. So we do have to take a brief break from the Quiet Place franchise, but we'll finish out strong with that hotly anticipated brand new sequel. But to a movie that felt awfully similar and was a hot add to the Netflix movie name. Bird Box came out to close out 2018. Perfect winter break streaming. And while you will know, and say what you will on this having the rep of a worse Quiet Place, the cast is filled with well-known actors. If you like American Horror Story as much as me, the show that kicked off this whole podcast palooza, you'll pretty much watch anything with Sarah Paulson in it. Yes, I am acutely aware I still have to see Ratched also on Netflix, which props for this movie being available to watch for free with a streaming service subscription. The list goes on, including B.D. Wong, John Malkovich, Trevante Rhodes, weirdly Machine Gun Kelly, and the lead Sandra Bullock. Also, as we had already talked about Get Out from the podcast before, and weirdly our Valentine's Day episode, look, we can't all be about real romance on that holiday after all. But Lil Rel Howery, that being his first movie role, killed it there. He is easily one of my favorite parts of this creature feature apocalypse story. Also, another brief, I don't know how I feel calling it a David Dalshmalshian movie, more like a minor movie role. There's that. Gosh, I hope he's awesome and a main part of the Suicide Squad. He needs a mainstay movie role to cement his awesomeness as this quirky character actor. So with Quiet Place, it's creatures who can't see you, but you make one sound and it's a bad last day for you. Bird Box instead is something a bit weirder. And I like strange, but the whole thing here is you can't look at things and it will make you kill yourself somehow, but they actually can't kill you themselves. It's a weird premise that is a lot to accept, but to the movie at hand, now that you know the rules it tries to play by. While we love boss Sandra Bullock telling these kids incredibly matter-of-fact how it is, that whole trend of how to even talk to kids at a point, that's a big TikTok one I remember from maybe 4 or 5 months ago. But naming them boy and girl is low-key hilarious and frankly a bit absurd. And as much as I love Sarah Paulson, they did her incredibly dirty here. She's just some lady spouting out random horse lady facts. The early on script in this is hilariously average. I feel like both Paulson and Bullock are playing characters they are not meant to. Paulson is at her best when it comes to things a little darker, especially her character's outlook. And Bullock is at her best as a little quirky, but in general, very likable role. It feels like they could have flipped the actors in the character roles. But some of this character dialogue is not terrible, but also not great. What is pretty gosh darn great is our first look at the almost epidemic nature of this horror. People seemingly fine, absolutely wrecking themselves. Sarah Paulson has to get across two sentiments in the same breath. One is standard day one apocalypse stuff. You know you want to get off the road. Good advice. Immediately followed by you want to be on a good horse. What the heck were they doing with this writing? They also decided to get rid of her character just a bit over 10 minutes in. Brutal and an absolute waste of her acting prowess as a random horse lady who dies briefly into this movie's start runtime. There is something scary about a fear of something that you have no clue what it is. That is for sure scary, and the visuals of panic and horror, they're excellent, and this movie makes all the death scenes surprisingly gory and hardcore. That helps when you literally don't have any visible sort of villain. I wish, there was a clear zombie or some evil thing that we could see, or if we saw the personified fears, it's scary to a point as is, but it's really hard to suspend disbelief when you're scared at the air. If anything, if one character is written well in a role that is made for a specific actor, John Malkovich as the old man with a gun who is hard and stuck in his ways, trying to lead everyone, suffering in early loss, but he's just not likable at all. He was perfect in the role. If there's one thing I remember liking here over A Quiet Place, it is the whole angle of a actual group. Maybe it's the zombie fan in me, but I love the random assortment of people thrown together in a situation to try and survive. Not only the insert not so great world event, but also the company and personality clashes of the rest of the group. And the archetypes of character tropes are all here. The young drug guy, the old lady who is still optimistic, the comedic relief, some law figure, no kids, but that is the only one missing, and clearly kids come later on with how this movie plays with its narrative structure. We rarely see a group develop from day one of the incident, but it's a fun, unique setting, and it's a nice, fancy house. Seemingly windows being broken by creatures is not the biggest fear. Just don't look at who knows what outside, and I guess you're good. It seems livable enough, but once we get to running around outside with blindfolds and more, it gets a bit trickier and honestly, a bit goofy. There is no one right way to tell a story. While beginning to end normally makes sense enough, sometimes it helps to mix it up. Pulp Fiction and the first of the Nolan Batman films of course play with narrative structure, but I care significantly of the group in the house and the day one beginning film moments as opposed to Bullock and some random kids on a boat in the water. Significantly less interesting. Honestly, this movie has awful pacing. It jumps from interesting group dynamics to this river storyline which seemingly breaks all the rules of not looking at anything and dying, to I guess some people can totally do it without any real explanation. This movie also flies through its characters. B.D. Wong is awesome in everything I've seen him in. Mr. Robot, Gotham, and hopefully people don't forget he is one of the main 3 actors in the original and best Mulan. He is the voice of Li Shang. He's also in the Jurassic series in a much smaller role, still optimistic for that final of the next trilogy. While I think of the one part of the driving blind to maneuver here, I immediately think it comes to mind the awesome driving mechanic from Daybreakers, a criminally underrated dystopian vampire movie that is so much fun with unique ideas about living in a vampire world. So vampires can drive in the dark without any windows. They have cameras on all sides of the car so they can maneuver in the sunlight with blacked out windows. I love those details there. And while painting windows and driving with a GPS is not nearly as cool, this too is one of the better moments of the film. Blindfolded walking does add a new level of tension for us watching. It might always look goofy, which is why it feels a bit off compared to A Quiet Place. The personal hell angle is fun, but we never see anyone's big fear scarecrow toxin moment. And look, the first Batman did great things with that. The first Nolan Batman. It's kind of brutal here and a bit of a letdown from a physical watching standpoint of just being like, it looks like you're scared of the air. It must be another apocalypse trope, but the grocery store scene is always one of my favorites. Who wouldn't want to have a whole grocery store to themselves? Let me alone in a Wegmans and I will have a blast. Gosh, I miss Wegmans. And honestly, with Howery, he's one of my favorite parts of this movie, which is why him dying so early in this movie sucks. But John Malkovich is the logical one who just makes sense, and he really does steal the show and add some much needed energy to this cast that sometimes feels a bit dull. Also, the whole bird thing. Birds being in a supermarket, That always feels a little too convenient. In the same way that everyone has enough blindfolds, somehow that is all a bit silly. Even the name of the movie, Bird Box. While I get eventually birds being in a box helps, something's just not there and missing for me. You know what else is missing? Characters just going off into the abyss and never being seen again, or ever explained to where they go and anything about them. You know, what happened to Machine Gun Kelly and the cop leaving the group? It's never explained, and honestly, I hate that stuff. This is why there is hit and miss moments for The Walking Dead with loose ends. Thankfully, they finished the Merle storyline. Thankfully, it took ages. We had a conclusion for the family who left season 1 with Morales. But badly, there are no real answers to the Vatos group. I talked about that deleted scene that should have been in our first half of the Walking Dead podcast episode recap. I have not forgot about that. I will get to part 2 eventually. And likewise, Corey Hawkins, who may just be too big for The Walking Dead now, after Straight Outta Compton, as well as the just-released musical film In the Heights. But gosh, do I need that story continued. Either in the final season, or more likely, and probably better off anyway, these Rick Grimes movies coming out at some point. This information on those is still famously limited at best. If there is one trope that always remains the same in these movies, kids are literally terrible in any apocalypse setting. The kids in A Quiet Place have gotten better, especially in the sequel, which is great. Carl grew to be so much more, and his death in the show, something not in the comics, was a huge fall-off point for a ton of viewers of the show. That and the whole bat beating, who did Negan kill at the end of a season, that was... Oh, the POV, that was not good in the worst way. But here, the kids are just standard garbage characters. Sorry if that's harsh. At some point, you kind of totally get Bullock just yelling at all these kids in these flash forwards. There is also a huge let-off in this movie, only seeing Bullock and some kids. You know all the characters that exist in this movie outside of that are not making it. And finding that out so early, you're just watching to see how everyone dies in the end. The eventual descent to Bullock being just like Malkovich is great, and the amount of times people keep letting other people in is dum-da-dum-dum-dum. Everyone yelling at Olympia? Rightly so, she keeps screwing up. Also, wild name that no one has ever named anyone before in America. Although, after doing some research, as I try to do for y'all, apparently 274 girls have been given that name in the United States since 1880. So some small faction exists. So for any Olympias listening, I guess that's a name I never would have heard before this movie. How about that? Yeah, at the end of the day, no matter how they go about it, the idea of some people not killing themselves after seeing these creatures and instead like being some cult that wants everyone to pull off their blindfolds, not every apocalypse group works. And honestly, this is probably the biggest letdown of both Bird Box and especially The Silence. This angle of these movies always feels a bit goofy. It almost feels like at times they ran out of places to go with whatever monsters, and instead they have to throw some bad guy humans along for the ride. I think in this movie the focus is still on this invisible fear alien, but in The Silence it takes a hard detour to who is the main villain, unfortunately. Thankfully, the minor at best in A Quiet Place Part 2, adding that people are the villain, because the focus is clearly on the actual creatures. But I will try to save my Quiet Place talk till we actually get to that film at hand. This movie immediately takes a hit with a whole group of people who make people look, that idea of a thing, especially with only one guy really doing it. And when they get rid of Malkovich, this movie is worse. He immediately is the best part of the movie. I feel like one bad guy being let in by the kindness of strangers and wrecking shit only works when they get rid of so many characters prior. You know, it's not even that bad. It's just one bad guy and that's it. I mean, eventually we encounter a whole group of these people, and even though that's the whole reason Dishmulsion is in it, there's something kind of whatever about so many people banding together to just rip blindfolds off other people. At least Rhodes gets some awesome action moments in his swan song to his character arc. Naming the kids to start boy and girl, it will never not be hilarious for the wrong reasons, but naming one kid after the guy she likes from the apocalypse, look, makes sense. She was very much a loner. Naming the daughter after that girl's dead mom kind of makes sense. What doesn't make sense is when she calls Olympia the sweetest girl she ever met, which she didn't seemingly like her or even know her for the longest time. And remember that sister she super stopped caring about after the first 15-20 minutes? Brutal. And this, of course, leads to the awkward moment of pretty much putting on the assumption that one child is being led to sacrifice to look at this moment when they need a look. The whole leading Harry Potter to grow up purely to sacrifice him to Voldemort, while we're never going to really believe that. There is some truth, of course, with that whole Horcrux thing. Thankfully, those are all back on HBO Max again, so if you want to have a Potter marathon this month and not have to take out discs of a Blu-ray or DVD player, now is the time. There's a nice come-up at the end with Bullock not going through this as she and this boy and girl all make it to the lovely bird sanctuary and they get names, which is always fun. Even though these creatures eventually, right before this, they seemingly get more abilities and they can seemingly try to talk to you and convince you to take your blindfold off. While that surprise creature mutation is dumb, the kid moment of her bonding with her son and her not her daughter, showing love is grand. But this again is something done better in the 2-film arc of A Quiet Place. Even the school for the blind reveal, which is, it all makes sense. Not everyone, but most people are blind. And having the warning bird signs, even that is just okay. The end note, while this movie isn't overall a good movie, there are good moments, and there are some truly bad moments. I'd say watch it once, but once you watch the Quiet Place movies, you'll realize that you're better off just watching that movie and eventually movies, if you have to pick after the fact. And the idea of these creatures being like the wind and never seeing them, knowing when you can and can't look at the air based on birds freaking out or not, is just a bit too wild for me. So when I first saw The Silence in 2019, after the other two Be Quiet or Don't Look spooky movies, I thought, well, it's on Netflix, so it's right there after all, might as well give it a watch. I also thought, well, I like Stanley Tucci. The amount of times I've brought him up throughout this podcast without having even done a Hunger Games episode is surprising. But overall, I remember this movie being, well, not good, but also not awful. What is a bit more exciting now is looking and remembering 2 different Sabrina vets round out the main 3 cast members, both Kiernan Shipka and Miranda Otto, who also was Éowyn from The Lord of the Rings after all. They're both in this movie. Must have felt like a comfort territory for them, with this movie coming during the midway part of The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina airing on Netflix. So now that you are abundantly familiar with all things monsters and not being able to use one of your senses or whatnot, this should all feel pretty similar. Gone are the blindfolds and back to not making sounds anymore movies. I will say, I'm pretty over the creatures they went with. Small little bat things in bulk that come up from an uninhabited underground from a long time ago. Super uninspired and whatever. Overall, you can't tell if this movie early on is trying to be a low-key vampire movie or an attempt at a scarier The Birds movie. Still haven't seen it. My mom says it's pretty scary. Nowadays, there's no world it is. But one day, I think there's an HBO Classic section that might have that. I know it has other stuff. I can't say I've outwardly searched for The Birds as a film. Look, there are some great actors in this movie. No doubt about it. Shipka is one of the main reasons Sabrina works so well. But we have to take each movie as it goes. We can't just say every movie with Sean Bean is good. As much as I'd love that, I know it's not true. And this movie, as it stands, is going to get so many comparisons to A Quiet Place without actors or anything else, just based on what it is. This movie will always be considered low-budget Quiet Place. And there's always that notion of casting a non-deaf actor in the role of a deaf character, especially when the world exists and the rules are all predicated on the actor being deaf. Millicent Simmons is masterful in both Quiet Place films, and is honestly great for representation, and when the plot revolves around that, especially like A Quiet Place and The Silence, you gotta do better. It builds to the authenticity of the story, at least. Hilariously, this movie continues to play archaic vampire music, even though seemingly that is never part of this movie. There's no big Dracula battle at the end. If you want that, stick with Castlevania. Or go watch The Strain. I can't wait to get back to that on Hulu. Almost done with season 1. At times, this movie tries to ramp up the gore and darkness, which, yeah, it does. But there's something that the Quiet Place franchise just does better. It is the overall tension of that world, the silence, any sounds you hear. It's all scary and terrifying. This is, at the end of the day, just another apocalypse movie. It has the fun niche of the other 3 movies here, but that's about it. There's something just missing here that comes off a bit whatever. I don't really care for anyone in this movie. Honestly, the saddest part is when they sacrifice their dog making too much noise. Hate, hate, hate. John Wick would have words with these people. Also, like Bird Box, the family group is smaller by nature, but you have the same whatever trope of characters you know who aren't going to make it. The faux leader who has some form of gun training, the sick person who's just going to make too much noise. I will try and not say it too much here, but this movie is just generic. Speaking of generic, if you're going to show your monsters, I know Bird Box went against the grain there, they have to look good-ish. These little vampire birds, not bussin', no sheesh required. This movie may be terrible. The convenience of just stumbling upon a compound with fences, some noise warning system mechanic, an open crawlable pipe, and more. Wild to start. Plus the hilarity of a lady yelling about, "Get off my lawn!" getting picked up and dropped in a well, making too much noise. Something about that always feels hilarious, and immediately this group has a nice cozy cabin. And they have a wood chipper distraction. Once again, brilliant and hilarious seeing these dumb-looking toothy murder birds fly headfirst into a wood chipper. Hilarious. So I liked parts of Bird Box. Of that there is no doubt. But when they got a bit too people are the big bad, it's a little too much. Bird Box kinda needed it without showing any creatures ever. This movie throws them people in even more. A whole actual cult with a religious zealot leader, who is all about cutting off tongues, apparently. I'm not gonna lie, there were times rewatching this movie where I was just messing around on TikTok. It really does not do a ton to keep you super engaged, and maybe if you're watching it the first time you would, but I don't know. It doesn't do a lot for you. Also, if that John Malkovich character was in this movie, this conflict would have been over immediately. He would have shotgunned all of these cult people. The whole movie's conflict would be over. The fact that cult guy immediately made a weird fertile comment at Tucci's daughter, and he did not immediately run train on these people, something is missing here, clearly. And also feels like this is a family of bumbling idiots and they're bad at securing their place. These people in these flicks are too easily trusting of seemingly helpless folk, I will say. There's something kind of witty about these weird cult people sending a child instead of strapped with like a bomb with phones and taping phones all over the house with alarms, because the internet is intermittently spotty and down, so that wouldn't work, so it has to just be alarms, I guess. This movie also has the sacrifice by yelling scene, which honestly is way less impactful than, you guessed it, how they do it in A Quiet Place. Instead, the big conflict is just a big old family murder party that everyone gets involved in. And the creatures just sort of exist flying around. At one part they help, but the storm's happening the whole time, which maybe distracts from the sound. I don't know, it feels like that there's some jumps in the logic at the end. Speaking of logic jumps, for some reason the group gets a convenient text before the internet intermittently dies about going to the north because of reasons, generically to the north, and somehow they get there and everything is all good after that. Yeah, they're like hunting these things with arrows, but that's it. Unlike my stance on this movie not being so good, this movie is just very whatever. So time for the first movie I've seen in theaters in over a year. The latest and TBD to see if it's the greatest. All I know is finally being back at my local Cinemark with Maria Menounos and all that never felt better. A Quiet Place Part 2 came out in 2021. While the idea of a sequel was not always in the cards, there's already talk about a Part 3 spin-off film? We'll see what that amounts to. The big cast add here is clearly Cillian Murphy, as much as I like Djimon Hounsou in the MCU films, Gladiator, and in general everything he is in. I can't wait for him, who seemingly is gonna get a very important role in The King's Man, the prequel to the King's Men films. That movie is seemingly loaded with people like Daniel Bruhl, Aaron Taylor-Johnson, and so many more. Here, his role is, spoiler again, very brief. Like we said when we started this episode, Krasinski's character is very dead. So the only way that we would have been able to see, of course, what he's doing in any time period has to be a flashback. And they take us back all the way. The days angle is briefly used at best here, and honestly, I'm very fine with that. But I love the continued use of this same town, seen from different time periods, how run down it has become throughout. They're not too far from this, and never were, seemingly. Krasinski's characters romp around town while things are still normal. The whole family is involved, even the youngest son, who is the only one to actually be recast. But fun fact, while we never really knew the younger kid in the first movie, here, his younger brother plays a character in the sequel. Fun attention to detail. While not every zombie movie shows the first day of the societal change, it took a spin-off show on The Walking Dead before we saw it there, and even that was sort of quickly moved past. Most things like this get you to think of the apocalypse. After seeing day one when these creatures came, seemingly from space, and started wreaking havoc on the town. And you smart knowing the rules of viewer, seeing all these people whispering, praying, and making all sorts of sound. And when that ringtone goes off, it's a miracle that the Abbott family, I know this is the first time I'm using their character's family name, makes it out alive. Also, seeing the rocket ship in the pharmacy, that item that helped the movie have an explosive opening. Oh, what a moment. If you were hoping for a miraculous comeback from the dead from Krasinski, let me tell you now, not a thing. But the beginning flashback is also a way to introduce us to Murphy's character. So while this movie doesn't pick up immediately after the first ends, it's pretty quickly after. And honestly, the attention to detail coming off a real recent rewatch right before watches, maybe 30 minutes apart, it's so good. Just seeing the stair nail give you PTSD from the first one, just waiting for someone to step on it again. But when that didn't happen, the family had to clearly leave. And this is a tough setup, moving 2 kids and a baby all through their oxygen tank crib thing. It's pretty cool. Once they get into the world outside of their little area, from their sand pathways to walking around on leaves and making sounds and stuff, they don't really find a whole lot of terrible people. They find traps that seemingly were made by terrible people. I love the tripwire bottle scene. While that was in the trailers, the aftermath of the bear trap on the son played by Noah Jupe. Like, damn, this movie, like the predecessor, finds a way to put the family in these settings you just can't expect them to make it out. And killing 2 of the 5 original family members in the last movie, you can't really think anyone is actually safe. While it takes a bit to get some traction going after this, the tension is always there. At a point you always wonder, damn, what are these kids doing still? Gosh. When their daughter, played by Millicent Simmons, goes off to save the day with her seemingly limitless powered hearing aid, after hearing To the Sea, a lovely song on the radio frequency, you're amazed and annoyed at her going out solo, thinking this leads to her and Cillian Murphy going out on a new adventure to the sea and find a boat and save the day. This story is easily the most entertaining and exciting and engaging, and I'm all about this. And while Emily Blunt and Noah Jupe are clearly the B story here, some of the tension is the best in those scenes. You feel like they were thrown a bit to the side. Don't get me wrong, seeing Blunt's character shoot an O2 tank that sets one of those, I guess we can call them aliens now, ablaze, it's a sick scene. And all of that tension of the O2 tank running out, of oxygen being locked in a sealed metal container, all while trying to keep a baby quiet and have airflow. There is something incredibly stressful in those moments, and this is for sure a huge part of the franchise, stressing you out, and the tone they set out to have. But narrative-wise, not a ton happens here. I guess the biggest moment for Jupe's character comes at the very end, but we'll get to that. While I will miss the full family being able to speak in sign language to each other, there is some added drama of having both Simmons and Murphy struggle to have and adapt to communicate in some pretty scary situations. When they do eventually get to a boat after some alien action, the bit of disappointment comes from the people as enemies angle. It feels the worst of the Walking Dead villains in the Wolves group. It's just some weird looking people making traps and doing bad things, because the world made them bad. While that setup scene doesn't do much, it's fun seeing these creatures come and wreck them for the implications of how bad they are. And thankfully our new dynamic duo makes it out to the island, hearing aid intact. The island is a pretty fun, divergent utopia, and after seeing for a moment that the aliens might be able to swim, and learning another weakness could be water, you feel pretty good about things. The people can make sounds, and everything seems great. No immediate danger and all that. Kinda like the World War Z Jerusalem wall scene. things seem great, but knowing the kind of movie that those both are, there was no way this was gonna last. And that thudding boat sound on the island, oh man, did that do something, and leading to another strong society, civilization carnage scene. And while Hanzo has some great moments on the island as our main character there, when he was just waiting around too long after getting to the radio station to figure out tech things, you knew he wasn't going to make it. For the longest time, I figured that was the plan for Murphy too. I was absolutely dreading the idea of this franchise becoming predictable and having a new father figure and continuing to kill them off. Because boy, we were real close to that. Thankfully, once the hearing aid is stuck to this radio broadcast, seemingly everyone can play that sound to hunt these aliens if they can get a radio signal. And that end moment of both Abbott kids killing an alien simultaneously in different settings. What a strong moment. Jupe's character has grown more confidence in this world, and he's more capable. And Simmons' character continues her growth as a super important mind in this world that needs to be saved. She carries on the legacy of her dad, which their relationship development was a huge part of this current 2-film arc. Super happy with the sequel, and if a trilogy is to come, we know there's a spin-off, but if there's a true trilogy, I can't wait to watch that in theaters as well. A lot good here. And Murphy is strong in the new role. But this is not a perfect movie either. So let's get on to another list of suspenseful, scary movies that you better not say words in or look at to survive. I know it's a mouthful for the genre list titling. At number 4 has to be The Silence, easily the weakest of the 4 films. The creatures are garbage. Love Tucci, love Otto, love Shipka. Just they did things bad in this movie, and making the people the biggest villain at the end, garbage. Number 3, A Bird Box. Loved parts of it. Love the group setting in the house. I think John Malkovich is awesome. Lil Rel Howery is great. Of course, we wish we had some Sarah Paulson in there. Bullock is totally fine in the role, but Sarah Paulson would have done some fun things, I think, if she was given the titular lead. I just don't think Bird Box has the consistent story and storytelling angle to make it that good. Got a couple quiet places. Sometimes the sequel is better. This is not one of those times, though. A Quiet Place Part 2 at number 2. It's tough to beat the original. A Quiet Place Part 2 does so much good. I think the people part is okay. I don't know if I love the idea of people being bad in this world, especially from what we got from A Quiet Place and with Cillian Murphy and with the island folk. It just doesn't really work. Quiet Place, the family story as a one-off, is immaculately told. Both these movies have a phenomenal way of making you absolutely stressed and terrified the entire time. And the jump scares are so well earned in A Quiet Place. Started this weird niche genre, did it well, and I think it would be really hard for anyone to top it. Probably the most predictable list I've ever done. I'm sure some people will have a favorite Quiet Place film. Some will like one, some will like two more. I think both are grand, and this spin-off thing coming in 2023 has me curious for sure. But the big question that I asked to you all is, which one was your favorite? I mean, if you really like Bird Box, let me know on social at either Knickknack Movies or Knickknack_IC on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Some fun things are on the horizon as next week plans to not only be one of the scariest franchises I have ever tackled, we will also have a special guest on the show for the first time in a long stint. Get ready as we conjure up some scares next week. But as always, and for now, cheers, and until next time, cinephiles.
Knick-knack goes to the movies.
Are you not entertained? I think this is going to be the beginning of a beautiful friendship. I don't like goodbyes. Let's just call this see you later, Alex.